Hello, my name's Ollie. I work at the World Economic Forum. Welcome to our Facebook Live studio for this 47th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum here in Davos, Klosters. Now, the meeting hasn't even started, but what we have started to do is give you some ideas of how we want this meeting to unfold, give you some ideas of how we want to create a better world, to essentially meet our mission to improve the state of the world. The purpose of this particular session is the Inclusive Growth Report. It's a new major piece of research that we put out today. It's essentially looking at how countries can make economic policies and growth strategies that are both good in boosting their GDP, the gross domestic product, the output that those economies make, but doing it in a way that is fair to people, that feeds through and improves people's lives, people's employment prospects, people's futures. I'm joined by my colleague, Rick Salmons, member of our managing board and the lead author of this report. It was his idea several years ago. Rick, I'm going to talk to you and turn to you now and ask you to explain a little bit about it. I'm just going to say before we did, this is not a new subject at all. Christine Lagarde, Eric Brynjolfsson, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, all last year spoke about this subject of how we need to move to a better system of measuring. Is this the development we've been looking for?
Thanks, Ollie, and hello, everyone. Yes, there are a few issues that are weighing more heavily on leaders around the world than this one. People feel in many different types of countries and different regions that we're not seeing broad enough progress in their livelihoods, in their lives. And, the economic policy establishment and political leaders are challenged right now. We've seen not only a decelerating economic growth, but a rise in inequality in many parts of the world. And this has created a big puzzle and a lot of soul searching. And so over the last couple of years, we've done a lot of multi-stakeholder consultation, done a fair amount of research, and have put together a set of practical suggestions that could help move this debate from a lot of diagnosis and a lot of aspiration to some practical action.
Rick, it's quite a radical solution.
Well, I think what we're suggesting here is that we need to rethink some of the assumptions for the way we organize our economies. It is absolutely the case that economic growth is essential to improving people's lives over time. You can't really give everybody a piece of the pie that's growing over time unless the whole pie is growing, and that's why economic growth is so important. But if you think about it, the bottom line way most people evaluate the success of their country's economy is not by the growth number that's published in the financial pages of their newspaper. It's really as to whether they see it in their lives, whether their incomes are up, whether they have better employment opportunity, whether they have a better cushion, a better sense of security economically, or whether basically they feel like they're just a paycheck away or a company decision away from losing their livelihood and the like. We call that living standards, and that is really the bottom line to economic growth, which is the top line. Business people are familiar with this top line, bottom line concept, and inclusive growth is a strategy to try to make the top line translate into the broadest possible progress in livelihoods and standard of living, which is the bottom line.
Rick, we've been talking a lot for years now at the World Economic Forum about the risks that income inequality poses. I believe it was the top risk facing the world according to our own research in 2011, and it's been keeping on as one of those top 5 risks ever since. We all know it's a problem. Our friends at Oxfam put out a major report today, on this very day, summing up the state of inequality in the world today. Is this the answer?
Well, I don't think we'd be presumptuous to say that we have the answer, that this is a panacea. But in a lot of general discussion and diagnosis, there's been very little in the way of concrete suggestions for what could be done. And so what we've done here is not only suggest that we need a new compass setting for the way we manage our economies, which is this concept of broad-based progress and living standards, of which growth is just one part, but also we suggest that we need something of a different mental map, a different basic way we think about how we organize that kind of bottom line progress. And many countries have been, since the financial crisis, they've pretty much reached the point of diminishing returns from very low interest rates, from extraordinary ways of creating monetary stimulus. And they have very limited fiscal space, which is to say that their public budgets don't have all that much more room to go. And so the world needs a new engine of growth and opportunity, and we think we've identified 15 different areas of the underlying institutional strength of countries where you can get a win-win, where if you strengthen these areas of what we call structural economic policy, then you can both raise growth by improving the fundamental attributes of the economy on the one hand, but it also has a big payoff for equity. And that's, in effect, a rebalancing of economic policy priorities. We need to give just as much priority to these areas of structural reform, a different kind of structural reform than has been talked about for decades, as we give to monetary and fiscal policy on the one hand and trade policy on the other. That's a new growth model in a way, and it's a practical suggestion for how to move forward.
It almost seems a little bit too easy. Why have these reforms not happened already?
I think we've been in a bit of what an academic might call path dependency. For the last few decades, most of the discussion about what economies need to do to succeed has been dealing with efficiency, trying to make market signals sharper, improve the flexibility of product markets and labor markets, and yes, of course, to try to get your macroeconomic house in order, balance your budget and make sure your inflation rates are low. These things are important, there's no question about that, but we've had an undue amount of emphasis on them, and we've, by comparison, neglected a lot of things you can do that influence the pattern of economic growth. That is to say, who benefits, whether it's sustainable and resilient over time. And so the model, if you will, I would suggest, has been unbalanced and a bit out of whack. And it's for that reason I think we've had a little bit too narrow a view. Another metaphor might be we haven't been firing on all cylinders because we've had the wrong compass setting. We've been mainly focused on efficiency and the top line metric of growth and not looking at the pattern of growth and how that influences the bottom line, which is rising living standards for all.
We can tinker with the engine and we can get a little bit more juice out of it. We've got some good questions coming in, so let's go to those. Mohammed Shahid, a few minutes ago, by increasing wages, by creating more jobs, and by free education. Not so much, I guess you disagree with that. We also have Azia Mohammed from Mauritius. Hi, Azia. Education is the main key driver to reduce inequality. Two questions on education. Has it got to be free? Is it the best way to reduce inequality?
Education is one of the most important things, but here you got to go deeper than where most of the debate has gone. A lot of countries have emphasized getting more people into university, and indeed for many of them that's quite important. But some countries actually have diminishing returns from raising their university enrollment rates, and they've been neglecting by comparison the investment in technical training and skilled trades and vocational education, despite the fact that that's where a lot of important jobs are in the marketplace. So they have big mismatches between the jobs available and the people who have the skills to do them. So there are a couple aspects of education that matter here. One is quality, yes, but it's the equity of access to that quality education, and it's also how well that education system is attuned to what the job market needs, and whether there is enough in the way of resources invested in people so that they can retrain over the course of their lives. Maybe 30, 40 years ago, you could expect to have a career in one job and one profession. But technology and other aspects of the economy are moving so fast that people often have to basically have 2 or 3 different career areas. So they need to be retrained and to continuously learn over time. That's another structural underpinning of a well-performing education system. So yes, I take the point that education is critical, and by the way, free public education, basic education, has been shown to be one of the most powerful ingredients of an inclusive development model. But our report identifies 14 other areas of the economy where you can build institutional strength that creates a better equity of outcomes and better growth at the same time. So education is a lot, but it's not everything.
And that's an interesting point, because I believe it's true for almost all of us that none of us have the right skills for the job we're going to be doing at the end of our working lives. You've got to keep reskilling and retraining throughout your lifetime, not just thinking about it as something you do whilst you're at school, whilst you're in your teens. Keep those questions coming. There's some really nice ones here. Let's start with Rana Reyes Saeed. Don't know where you're from, Rana, but your question is, why so much inequality between richest and poorest?
Well, I think it varies by country. We have data covering 109 countries, and we give both performance metrics, that is to say 12 different measures of a broad-based view of national economic performance, some of which deal with inequality. And then we have what we call policy metrics, which is basically a way to benchmark how strong your education system is or your infrastructure, or how well your financial system is channeling money to the real economy, to business, capital formation, and so on and so forth, including social protection systems. Countries can have different approaches to lowering inequality. So some countries may have a very weak safety net and a relatively regressive or not very helpful tax system. And they could have the best opportunities for reducing inequality by fixing or improving those parts of the puzzle, if you will. Other countries actually have a pretty good safety net and a fairly progressive tax code, but they've neglected a whole bunch of other areas of institutions and structural policy that affect how much inequality there is even before you get to what we call as economists fiscal transfers, before we start dealing with social security or unemployment insurance or redistributing through the tax code. So there's no ideal single policy mix here. And the main point is that inequality is not something from heaven. It's not something that we just have to accept. There are, as we suggest, 15 different levers you can pull, and the key is to view that whole thing as an ecosystem and see how well your country is doing relative to its peers in those domains, and then where you're relatively weak, do what a business would do and is trying to break into a new market or develop a new strategy. Benchmark yourself, learn from what the leading practices are, and in that way, through a multifaceted strategy, then you can really attack the inequality problem.
Which is great, but then there's going to be a natural bias. Some richer countries are going to find this easier. This is something which only rich countries can do.
No, it's interesting. You look at the pattern of the data here across the 109 countries. We have 140 indicators that we measure across these 15 domains. And you see that it's not purely correlated how rich the country is. Some countries that are relatively poor do better in some of these areas than their richer peers, and vice versa. So, like I say, this is not preordained. You can work this problem if you have the proper mental picture of all of the levers you can pull, and if you apply as much emphasis on that as a finance minister typically would do to, how well the banking system is functioning, or what the budget looks like for the country.
Let's change tack. Ankita Srivastava, Ankita, I've just pronounced your name wrong, I'm sure, so apologies for that one, is asking about free healthcare. Is free healthcare a good idea in large economies, or any economy? Is this something you're looking at?
Here again, I think there's no ideal solution or mix here. It really depends on the choices that the country itself wants to make. So for some countries, I can absolutely see that having a national health service, which reduces very, very significantly the out-of-pocket costs, is a really important way to try to raise people's living standards throughout society. In other cases, countries may choose to emphasize some other areas where they think they could have a bigger impact. So I think the main thing, though, is if an economy is only providing good health care to a narrow segment of the population, or only to those who have particularly large means, income or wealth, then that's a big problem. And they need to find a way, since health is so fundamental to human potential and economic opportunity, they need to find a way to crack that problem. And indeed, free or low-cost universal health care can be an extremely potent device.
At last I found a question I can answer, so Rick, just take a pause. How can I get the report? Hector Torres is asking. It's on our website. It was on there from 9 o'clock this morning, www.weforum.org. A couple of really quick questions I'd love to cover off. Tax evasion and corruption, and what is their impact? Klaus Schwab, our our founder and executive chairman mentioned corruption as one of the single greatest challenges facing capitalism today. And is free trade helpful in the long term? So corruption, free trade.
Free trade. No question. We emphasize corruption and what we call concentration of rents, which is to say whether the people who own the assets have an undue control over economic decisions in the country and the capturing of the income from those assets, and whether there's big high barriers to entry. In other words, where the opportunity for competition from upstarts to compete and potentially challenge those incumbents is robust. So corruption and concentration of rents is one of the big elements of inclusive growth. And yes, we have data, and you can see countries that do relatively well or relatively poorly in this regard. And there are some surprises. I come from the United States, and the United States in our last survey ranked dead last among advanced countries for the perception of how well incumbents had captured the regulatory process, if you will. That means that there's a sense that there's a suppression of competitive signals in the market because of the ability of incumbents to have a bit of a significant amount of control over the political decision making as it affects their industry. So, everybody talks about corruption being a big problem in poor countries. I'm not suggesting the United States has the same level of problem, but the point is that this is a big deal for all sorts of countries and deserves attention.
Free trade?
Trade. This is, of course, one of the big hot potatoes in this debate.
Keep those questions coming.
And here's what I would say in this regard. I think this is another example where we've been not firing on all cylinders in economic policy. And another way of saying that is that there's a basic validity to the social concerns about the emphasis placed on trade liberalization over the last years. And I'm speaking as somebody who's got a fair amount of depth in trade policy, both in terms of analysis and government experience. The problem is that if you open markets and you expose people to all sorts of additional competition, at the same time, you've got to do some things to strengthen the underpinnings of their ability to compete and to adjust to dislocation. And many countries have been really focused on free trade agreements and have really neglected some of these very important domestic reforms that are needed to ensure that the people are prepared for the competition and can adjust and adapt whenever there's a change in the market. Training, job matching, lifelong learning, a social safety net in terms of unemployment insurance that is broad in coverage and adequate in benefit levels, and a variety of other things that really matter for people's security. And I believe that one of the ways that the economic model has been unbalanced in the last couple of decades has been this disproportionate emphasis on trade on the one hand, as important as that can be for building wealth and improving the level of production and income. But we need a similar degree of emphasis on these other aspects of the domestic institutional support for people, and that has not been occurring as much as one would like.
And remember, everybody out there, just please do share this and please keep those comments coming, because we want this to be one of the big debates during Davos. We've got leaders from all over the world here coming, and we want to make sure this discussion is one of the single most important discussions and that something solid comes out of it. So let's keep this conversation as active as possible. Hannah Maria is asking me 3 minutes ago, what about enforced equal distribution of wealth? Can we do that? Do we want to do it?
Well, again, that's a choice of every individual country. There's a spectrum here. It's not a black or white situation. Most economies, particularly advanced economies, have what you just articulated, which is a forced distribution of wealth or income through the tax code. And some of them do more of it or less of it. And I would submit that you need to do more of it if you've been paying less attention to the things that affect what we call market inequality. That is to say, how unequal the society is even before you get to the tax code and to social safety net and social insurance. So we're already down the road on, and have been for almost 100 years in many countries, on a redistribution that is forced because it's part of the law, it's part of the tax code. The issue, I guess, maybe you're getting at is whether that should be ramped up. And I would submit to you that, it depends. Some countries have done that to the point of suppressing the kind of signals for people to go out and try to create new things and create wealth themselves. So there's been in some cases, too big a tax burden, particularly on wages in this regard. So you have to get the balance right, is what I would say.
Now, who can remember the theme of last year's annual meeting? It was, of course, the fourth industrial revolution, that huge transformational impact of modern technologies, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, drones, neuroscience, everything coming together and affecting our economy and our society in ways that we don't yet know. Okay, it's back. This question is going to be one which is so important, frankly, Rick. What is the impact of artificial intelligence on inequality?
Well, there's a lot of debate about this right now. Some people estimate that automation of various types, whether it's robots in manufacturing or AI and artificial intelligence in service industries, is poised to disrupt another 10% of employment in many countries over the coming several years or decade. And so it poses a large potential challenge. On the other hand, there's some big opportunities here as well, because just like the internet and other types of technology have created all sorts of new services and products and improved quality of life in many respects, this will be no doubt also the case in many regards regarding artificial intelligence. The issue is that we got to be nimble. We got to anticipate this. We got to make sure we have some norms so that the AI, the artificial intelligence, is not used for nefarious purposes or to unduly impinge on people's privacy or other personal rights, if you will. But at the same time, we've got to look at what we need to do to equip people to shift into some of the new jobs and industries that are going to be created, and to have a better transition in doing so. So we in the report outlined 5 areas of policy that really matter if what you want to do is to invest in your people so that they can thrive in this fourth industrial revolution. And I have to say the data indicate that very few, if any, countries are very strong across all 5 areas.
We're running pretty much close to time. I want to do 2 more questions if I may, Rick. Sashank Sandhi is asking, what impact is Brexit going to have on inclusive growth and inequality?
I think Brexit is another example where we're seeing a signal from the population that they're sort of maxed out on change. And some of that has an economic dimension. And if you look at the UK's rankings in our data here, you can see that the UK does worse on inclusive development in our global index than they do on the traditional rankings just based on a gross domestic product alone. That's another marker that they've had not a sufficiently inclusive development model, and that translates into a sense of precariousness, if you will. So I think that's the main lesson from UK Brexit.
I've already decided what my last question is going to be, but I can't resist this one. Rahul Jinder, brilliant question. Isn't there a need for a radical shake-up in terms of the economic thinkers we have? Do we see the same experts? It's part of a problem, the fact that we have the same experts year after year telling us what needs to be done.
I mean, I think it's a fair point, and it's a central part of the reason why we put out this report, because it does challenge the status quo. I mean, as I say, we're arguing that GDP growth is important, but it isn't the bottom line. And economic policy should now orient itself toward broad-based progress and living standards. We've argued that finance ministers have an unduly concentrated amount of focus on macro policy and trade policy, for that matter, and that you need to look at these various areas of the strength of your domestic economy that matters. And lastly, we've put up an alternative measure of national economic performance. And so in a way, we're agreeing with your premise. We need to listen to what societies are telling us and to rethink our assumptions and be prepared to rethink things.
People should be boasting about, not about how big their economy is, but how inclusive their economy is and how fair their economy is. So let me come to the last question. Alan Beck, I'm not sure where you're from, Alan, but it's a great question, and it's a good one for us to answer to. Alan's asking, if we don't use GDP, what is the measurement we should be using?
Well, take a look at our report. We're proposing a new index that has 12 what we call key performance indicators of inclusive growth and development. And one of them is indeed GDP growth, but there are 3 groups of 4 indicators. One on growth and development. Growth and development is like healthy life expectancy. How long do people live on average in a healthy state? Labor productivity, for example. And inclusion includes both income inequality and wealth inequality, which is a big problem and has been getting worse in 3/4 of countries over the last 5 years we've seen, as well as median living standards, median income, if you will, and the poverty rate. So that's a second big cluster of indicators. And the third one is intergenerational equity and sustainability. It's really not truly inclusive growth if you're basically borrowing from future generations for the current generation to have a nice standard of living. So we have things that look at environmental sustainability, including the carbon intensity of GDP, and also the extent to which natural capital is being depleted in the country, natural resources and the like, how much investment is going into people, human capital formation, as well as what's the demographic dependency ratio, what's the proportion of the population that's working and supporting those who are kids on the one hand and senior citizens on the other. So that's a pretty good marker of whether the country's got a sustainable set of public finances. So we put all 12 of those together and we blend them into a composite index, and that's, in our way of thinking, an interesting concrete example of an alternative way of measuring an economy's progress to the conventional one of GDP.
This is how we move beyond GDP. So please don't forget, once this video is finished, please do share it. The best way to keep this conversation going, to keep the subject of inequality and inclusion at the top of the agenda for people here and throughout the year, is to get this as high a profile as possible. So you can all help us. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. This session is now finished.